Hey everyone, as we celebrate Digital Learning Day, we know there's a lot going on in education right now. Most of it inspiring, and some of it, let's just say, concerning. There's been a flood of news from Washington, and we want to wrap today with a quick, straight to the point chat about what's at stake for our students and what you can do about it. And to break it all down, we have Phillip Lovell, All4Ed's Associate Executive Director, who spent the last 2 decades, wow, that's a long time, walking the halls of Congress, fighting for kids and public schools. Phillip, let's start at the top. What's the federal role in education, and why should we care?
Awesome. Well, thanks, Adam, for the invitation to be here. So first things first, education is mostly state and local responsibility. Teachers, principals, and school boards, they're the ones who are making the big calls about what students learn every day. The federal government does play a crucial role, even though it's not really a very visible one. So at its core, the federal role is really about ensuring that education is a right, not just a privilege, especially not just a privilege for the few. So the federal role here is making sure that all kids, whether they have disabilities, whether they're learning English, whether they live in a rural community, or they're in foster care, or they're experiencing homelessness, that all kids have access to a quality education. The federal role is to protect students from discrimination and harassment. It's to support states and districts with funding to make sure that we have a level playing field, especially for young people who live in low-income communities. So the federal government was really, in the Department of Education, was created to make sure that public education serves all, not just some.
All right, I think I got it, but I feel like there's still kind of a lot of confusion out there about what the federal government actually does. What are some of the common myths that you hear, Phillip, about what the federal government does when it comes to education?
Indeed, there are definitely myths about what the federal government does and does not do when it comes to education. One of the biggest myths is that the federal government dictates what schools teach, and
right.
it just doesn't. The federal government does not set education standards. It does not decide what textbooks or what curricula schools use. It doesn't set graduation requirements. In fact, federal law actually prohibits the U.S. Department of Education from requiring a specific curricula, from setting standards. So when people say that the Department of Education is controlling education, it's just not true.
Wow. So there's a lot of confusion on that because I'm one of those people, time to time, I get on social media and I read a lot, and there's a lot of confusion on that. To the tune where people are like, yeah, let's close the Department of Ed. So I've heard it. I've seen some things happening. I think we are about to have a hearing right now on our Secretary of Ed. But my question is, are we going to be closing the Department of Ed? Is this really happening?
So it's a very good question, and there have been calls to close the Department of Education since the Department of Education was opened. Right. I'll say that the activity that's taking place now, to me, is much more worrisome than we've seen in the past. So here's the deal: the president can weaken the Department of Education, and we need to just expect that to happen. It's happening right now. We've already seen it. So, for example, in the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Education, they've already dismissed cases regarding book bans. Right. So this is happening. At the same time, the president can't just shut down the Department of Education on his own, at least not without violating the law, because the Department of Education was established in law by Congress. So the reality is that two things are happening at the same time, right? There's actions happening at the executive level to weaken the Department of Education, and you've got folks on the Hill who are fighting back to try to keep the Department of Education. And spoiler alert, the public really doesn't support this idea of closing down the Department of Education. The polling that you hopefully heard at the top of the hour really shows that Republicans and Democrats alike do not want to close the Department of Education. So this is something where there's actually some unanimity among Republicans and Democrats on.
That's good news, and I'm an optimist. But let's go pessimist and worst case scenario here. What would happen if I know if the department actually gets dismantled? I mean, what does that actually mean? How does that trickle down to schools and students? What does that affect?
Yeah, so I mean, the reality, and I don't mean to sound, like all doomsday, but like it could be really devastating. I'll give you a couple of examples. So, students with disabilities have a legal right to a free, appropriate public education. And most people in the education world, they know what an IEP is, right? Those are federal requirements. So if we're talking about just eliminating the federal role in education, our students with disabilities would lose those rights and would lose those opportunities. Title I funding, right? Title I is the largest federal education program. It supports young people from low-income communities, right? If we lose a federal role in education, we could lose Title I funding. And actually right now, there's a proposal in the House of Representatives to cut Title I funding by about $5 billion.
Wow.
And the estimates are that we could lose 72,000 teachers nationwide if we lose that $5 billion to Title I, right? There's also things that, important to talk about on, say, Digital Learning Day, funding for Wi-Fi hotspots. The Federal Communications Commission recently passed new policy that allows the E-rate program to fund Wi-Fi hotspots, but legislation has been introduced to revoke that new policy. It's now pending in the Senate. So, it's not. I'm not trying to be a fearmonger. It's just reality. Now, what's also reality is that this stuff isn't inevitable. That's why we need people to speak up.
Like, just listening to what you said, it checked all personal boxes for me. Like, my daughter has an IEP. I worked my entire career in Title I districts and that received funding, and one of my jobs was a title funded job. And of course, with E-rate being a former technology director, a lot of the work that I did in school districts were utilizing E-rate funding to ensure connectivity. We were able to utilize some of those funds to have resources for students who need them. Right. But I know our listeners out there, they took all that in, but we're about that action, as the kids say. So our educators, our school leaders, our tech directors, they're just not going to listen to this stuff. They want to do something. So what's the best thing that all of our listeners out there, whether you're an educator or a parent, there's somebody walking down the street, what is the best action that they can take to support our schools?
Sure. So there are a couple of things. So one is be sure to stay informed, right? So today, the nominee for Secretary of Education was testifying on Capitol Hill, right? We need to be listening to what's happening and we need to be responding to it, supporting what we support, opposing what we don't, right? We need to be ensuring that our elected officials really know the full story about public education and how much we support it. Because what happens is that there's a really vocal minority that speaks really loudly, right? And so like our polling data shows, for example, that most people oppose closing the Department of Education. But if our policymakers are only hearing from the vocal minority that actually support closing down the Department of Ed, right, there's the perception that, oh, this is great, let's do this, right? When obviously we know that that's not what's the best thing for kids. So we need to make our voices heard. One way folks can make the voice heard, check out the link at the bottom of the screen, and there's a letter that that you can sign that is to the incoming Secretary of Education that asks for her strong support for public education and for a strong Department of Education to defend public education as a right, not just a privilege.
Well, Phillip, Adam and I appreciate all the work you've been doing all these years, 2 decades of work. We applaud you. And you heard the message there, folks. I mean, it doesn't matter. I mean, if you're a teacher, a principal, tech leader, anyone involved in schools, a supporter of public schools, this is your moment right now. So again, check out that link that's below. Make your voice count. It only takes less than a minute, but let's be honest, it could make a huge difference when it comes to public education.
Well, thanks very much for having me.